Can a really cheap lens beat a really expensive lens? Today I've brought together my cheapest 50mm lens and my most expensive one, and there's a gap of about 140 quid between them. Which will emerge victorious? Do you need to pay top dollar, or can you get by very easily with something cheaper? Well, today we find out, so stick around. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Here is my cheapest 50mm lens. It's a Miranda 50mm f2. It cost me about 10 or 15 pounds a few years ago. And here is my most expensive lens. It's a Zeiss Planar f1.7 50mm, and this cost me about 140 pounds, I think it was, a few months ago. Now you might automatically think that the Zeiss is better, but is it actually better? Do you really need to pay top dollar to make a really nice image? Shouldn't there be a massive gulf between these lenses? Well, let's find out. Okay, first of all, let's look at their construction, and I've got to say it's actually broadly similar. The Miranda, let's look at the Miranda first. The Miranda is an all plastic lens. Certainly the body is all plastic. There's no metal at all on the outside of this lens, although I think there must be metal for the focusing helix and the aperture mechanism going on inside there. But the body is all plastic, and you know, it's none the worse for that. I've used this lens quite a few times and I've never thought, oh my goodness, what a shame that's a plastic lens, especially considering the very, very cheap price that I got it for. This lens, I can't remember exactly, but it was really cheap. It cost me 10 or 15 pounds a few years back. Here's the Zeiss lens. It's heavier, but only by what? Not that much. Maybe it's a third again heavier than the Miranda. So there is more metal, most likely, in this lens. Surprisingly, some of the body is actually plastic on this lens, and so in some senses there's not a great deal of difference between the construction of the Zeiss and construction of the Miranda. One big difference is that this part at the front here on the Zeiss is metal, whereas on the Miranda I'm pretty sure that's not metal. It's not very cold. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's plastic. So the front part on the Zeiss is metal, the actual bit that extends and comes in and out, and on the Miranda it's plastic. So maybe the Miranda is an entirely plastic lens, I really don't know. However, the Zeiss is not, although it does have some plastic on its body, and that, I've got to say, was really surprising. But you know, there you go. I guess make economies where you can. It's got the very nice Zeiss T-Star coatings, and they're rumoured to be, or said to be, not rumoured, they're said to be really, really good at preventing sort of dropping of contrast in the sunlight. And that, of course, is something that the Miranda doesn't have. The Miranda does have coatings. It is a coated lens, and I'm pretty sure it's a multi-coated lens. Yeah, the rear element also is coated, but it's a fairly thin coating. I don't think there's a great deal of anti-reflective stuff, whatever it is, been applied to that lens. I've never had any problems with it shooting in strong light. It does flare and lose contrast in strong light, but I've never found a vintage lens that doesn't. Even the Zeiss Planar will do that. Although how easily they do it is another question. Construction then, in one sense broadly similar, but clearly the Zeiss is the heavier lens, and clearly it's got more metal in it. Okay, let's take a look at the images. I've got them here on my computer, so we can have a look at those now and see what we think. And I've got to say, when I first looked at these images, I thought, ah, great, there's no real difference between them. And I've got to admit, when I started this test, I did want the Miranda to come out of it well, because I do always support the underdog. I can't help it. It's just a thing that I do. So when I first looked at the images, as I say, I thought, well, those are broadly similar. You can't really put a hair between those. But then I looked again, and I'm looking now, and I can see pretty clearly that the Zeiss is consistently sharper, both wide open and at the other apertures that I shot at, which were f4 and f5.6. And the Zeiss was consistently sharper, only by a whisker, not by very much, just by a little hair. I mean, see what you think. You know, you can see the images pretty much the same as I can, but I have to say that the Zeiss is that bit sharper. The Zeiss is a very sharp lens, and this is the only lens that's ever beat my CZJ Pancolar 50mm f1.7 in the sharpness stakes. And in fact, this is the sharpest 50mm that I've shot, although the CZJ does come close. So I'm not too surprised that it's beat the little Miranda. I think the little Miranda stood up very, very well for itself. It's not quite as sharp as the Zeiss, but it's very nearly as sharp as the Zeiss. And if you stop it down to f4, say, or even f2.8 or f3.5, stop it down a little bit, and it gets very, very sharp indeed, although it never is quite as sharp as the Zeiss, even when you stop it down. But shoot the Miranda stock down, and you know, if you've never compared it to the Zeiss, you know, you'd conclude that you've got a nice sharp lens, but it's not quite as sharp as the Zeiss one. Okay, let's talk about colour. Well, when I first looked at the images, I concluded that the Zeiss was far, far better for colour reproduction and colour rendering. It just seemed that little bit richer, it seemed that little bit stronger and more present in its colours. And then I looked again, I saw that I'd actually shot the Zeiss images a little underexposed. I did have to improvise a little bit because it was chucking it down with rain, just like it is at the moment when I was shooting these images, so I did have to improvise. But I thought the Zeiss was better to begin with, and then I adjusted the exposure. And now I look at them again, well, I really can't see too much difference between them in terms of colour rendering. They seem pretty much the same in that department, you know, regardless of whether they're shot at f2 or f1.7, you know, fully open, or whether you stop them down a bit. The colour performance of these two lenses seems to be pretty much the same. Colours are bright, they're full of energy, they're resonant, and this is in both lenses. The images from both lenses have very, very nice colour. Then I looked again, and I thought to myself, there's something just a little bit different going on here, just slightly different. And it seemed to me, see what you think, but it seemed to me that the Zeiss had very slightly better contrast. Difficult to say if that's absolutely accurate, but I think on the whole the Zeiss does have slightly better contrast and holds the image together slightly more. Especially wide open, you can see that the image from the Miranda is just that little bit more washed out, and it's just not quite as nice an image. Stop down, it's different, but wide open, it really isn't quite as nice an image. Stop them down to f4, and again it's a little difficult to put a hair between these lenses, except to say that I do think the Zeiss has slightly, only slightly better contrast. Okay, let's look at background blur. How do these lenses blur out the background? Do they do it nicely? Do they give a nice soft wash in the back of the shot? Are they a little nervous? What's going on with them? Now, when I shot the Zeiss lens not too long ago, I've got to say I wasn't too impressed with its background blur. It doesn't make the nicest, tidiest background blur I've ever seen from a vintage lens. It's not dreadful, it's just not as nice as some others. The Miranda, from memory, a similar story. It can be nice and soft, just like the Zeiss can be, but it doesn't always stay nice and soft. But let's be empirical. Let's look at the shots and see what we've got. Well now, I think the Miranda might be just a little softer than the Zeiss in its background blur. The Zeiss seems fractionally, marginally a little more nervous than does the Miranda, although I have to say, as with the other factors in this lens, in this test rather, there really isn't much in it, and background blur is actually quite similar from both these lenses. There's not a great deal of difference in the quality of the blur, and there's not a great deal of difference in the nature of the blur. They both seem to give a very similar signature in the background blur department, and that's true when you stop them down a little. It's true when they're wide open. They just make similar blur, these two. They're both a little untidy, although I've got to say I think the Miranda might be slightly the tidier and less nervous of the two. And that's a nice unexpected result for the Miranda. Although I say it's unexpected, it would be difficult. It would be difficult to have blur that is more nervous than this Zeiss gives. I can't imagine a lens giving blur that's more nervous than that from the Zeiss. However, in this test, I think it's fair to say, see what you think, but I think it's fair to say that the Miranda gives slightly softer blur, and that is a nice little kind of win, you know, just by a few percentage points for our little underdog Miranda here. Okay, when it comes to vignetting, that is dark corners and dark sides of the shot. That's usually seen when the lens is wide open. As regards vignetting with both of these lenses, well, you may not be surprised to learn by this point that they are once again broadly similar in the amount of dark corners that they give to a shot. Both of the lenses lighten up very considerably when you stop down from fully open at f1.7 in the case of the Zeiss and f2 in the case of Miranda. When you stop down to f4, there's a big difference in vignetting. But wide open, I've got to say, these ones are about the same. These two lenses give a similar amount of darkening in the corners when you shoot them wide open. Now, that might be just a marginal win for the Zeiss because, of course, it opens up to f1.7 rather than to f2, and that's a little wider, so naturally that's going to give some more vignetting. It's going to give, inherently, it's going to give a greater amount of vignetting than the Miranda. The fact that they look broadly similar, perhaps we can award a win to the Zeiss there, a marginal win, because it's, they do look pretty similar. But I think we'll award it because the Zeiss is a slightly wider aperture. It's a slightly faster lens. So a marginal victory for the Zeiss there. Okay, let's talk about chromatic aberration. That is when if, for example, you're shooting, you're out shooting and in part of your shot is the branch of a tree and it's shot against the sky. Well, chromatic aberration refers to the purple or green fringing that you sometimes get around such tree branches or other, usually fairly slim objects against a very bright background. The effect is more fully seen when the lens is wide open. Now, shooting this Zeiss lens a little while back, I was astonished by how bad it is actually at chromatic aberration. I had thought that this lens, being a Zeiss lens, would have very, very little chromatic aberration at all. However, when I shot it wide open, I'm talking wide open here, when I shot it wide open, gosh, it was one of the worst lenses I'd ever shot for chromatic aberration. It really does have a lot of it. It disappears to quite a large degree when you stop down, but it is there wide open. It's there pretty prominently wide open. So is the Miranda going to beat it? Surely, surely. This little lens, our little champion little underdog, can beat the performance of the Zeiss. Well, let's have a look at the images. Did it actually beat it? No, it didn't. No, it didn't. It's if anything, it's marginally worse, but it's broadly similar. It's about the same. It disappears when, or rather reduces, I should say, not disappears, when you stop the lens down. And by f4, neither lens really shows very much trace of the purpley stuff, the purple fringes or green fringes. But wide open, they are broadly similar. So another broadly similar for these two lenses. I think there's getting to be quite a lot of broadly similars for these two lenses, and I think that is true of their chromatic aberration performance. So which of these lenses is better, and should you buy the Zeiss lens? Well, according to this test, I would say no, you really don't need to buy the Zeiss lens. You could make very similar shots with the Miranda. They won't be as sharp. That's the only thing. The Zeiss images will be that bit sharper, and sometimes that can give the game away. It's really not quite up to the standards of the Zeiss, and that makes the difference. So I guess in this case, that's what you're paying for. Plus the nicer construction, although it is a bit plasticky, the Zeiss is a bit plasticky on the outside. They're both nice lenses, but at the end of the day, the Zeiss is nicer. Is it worth the 120, 30 quid's difference between the Miranda lens? Well, if you want the absolute sharpest, yes, it is. But if you just want a nice lens to shoot casually, it probably isn't. You're probably just as well satisfied with a lens like this very, very cheap Miranda. So there we are. Okay, let's talk about this lovely thing that the nice people at Pergear sent me. This is a CF-A memory card of 256 gigabytes capacity, and they're a sort of an evolution of the CF card. I remember the big cards that we used to use back in the day. This is CF-A. Now, CF-A cards are mostly used by the later Sony cameras, for example, the A1, the A9, the Video FX3 and FX30 cameras. So these are pretty much for Sony cameras. So if you have a Sony camera, and especially if you're a Sony video shooter, these cards are really cool. Other brands, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, use CF-B cards, but these are almost exclusively for certain Sony cameras. Not all Sony cameras. They won't go in my A7C, for example, but they will go in the ones that I mentioned. What's great about these cards? Well, they're fantastic because of the speed that they run at. The max read speed, I'm sure you can, well, you can see it on the box. So the max read speed is 1780 megabits per second, and the max write speed is very near to that at 1600 megabits per second, and that's really quick. You know, if you're a video shooter and you're shooting 4K or 8K video, these things are what you need. These things, you know, the buffer, they've got a huge buffer on them, and it just doesn't run out. So Pergear CF cards come in 3 speed ratings. There is standard, professional and master. This is the master version. The great thing about these Pergear cards is they are rather cheaper than many other brands. Sony cards and other cards from manufacturers with, you know, sort of bigger names, the bigger name manufacturers, you can buy those cards and they work fine, they work brilliantly, but they're a lot more expensive than these Pergear cards. These Pergear cards are much, much cheaper than many other cards you can buy. So there we are, a fantastic little memory card, great for 4K and 8K shooting, very economical to buy, and great also if you've got multiple shots to do and you're shooting stills. So there we are. I found that lens test really interesting, and I really didn't think that the Miranda was going to come anywhere near the Zeiss lens, but as you can see, it actually does. So you really don't need to pay top dollar to get a nice image from a vintage lens. So I guess that is about it from me for today. Many thanks for watching, and if you've watched this far, particular thanks to you. Many thanks to subscribers. That is a real heartfelt, genuine thanks. And if you like this episode, if you've enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe? Please do subscribe yourself. The more subscribers I get, the easier it is for me to bring you new material. Many thanks also go to patrons for your support. That is invaluable support. If it wasn't for that support, I would not be able to make these shows in the way that I do. So many thanks, a genuine heartfelt thanks for that support. If you like these videos, and if you think this show isn't doing too bad a job of keeping this old gear alive, the old cameras, the old lenses, and bringing it forward so another, so another generation can enjoy it, please do consider becoming a patron yourself. You can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do it for as little as $1 per month. Please do consider that if you enjoy the show. Thank you. As for me, that is it for now, and I've just realised I forgot to put my hat on for this shoot. There we are. But that is it from me for now. So thank you for watching. Thank you to everybody who's subscribed, everybody who's a patron. Thank you to everybody who's engaged with the channel in any way. I really appreciate it. And if you're not doing anything too irksome, difficult, bothersome, annoying, or truculent next week at around this time, please do tune in and join me for another spot of Zenography. Cheerio all.